Mail-order bride arrived in rags on Christmas Eve. The lonely rancher saw her worth and chose her. The lanterns along Copperbend's main street flickered like small, restless spirits against the warm dusk, their gold glow catching on dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Rowan Tate stood among the evening crowd, boots planted steady, hat rimmed low, a man shaped by the land yet belonging to none of the people around him. He nodded to a passing neighbor, though the exchange felt hollow, as if politeness had replaced real human closeness long ago. A stagecoach rattled in with a tired groan, its wheels kicking dust that curled in the lamplight like smoke rising from an old fire. Rowan wasn't expecting anything unusual that night, and yet something tugged at him, urging his gaze toward the coach's worn wooden door. A woman stepped down slowly, gripping the metal handle, as though it were the last thing keeping her upright. Her clothes were thin, torn along the hem, stitched and restitched until the fabric barely held. A faded buckskin dress clung to her frame, and she wrapped a frayed blanket tight around her shoulders, as if hiding her own heartbeat. Copperbend residents turned their heads, not out of kindness, but curiosity sharpened with judgment. The rancher felt an odd ache rise quietly inside him, a feeling he had not expected to revisit tonight. Something about the woman's posture, defiant in its fragility, pulled at him like a whispered story waiting to be told, and he found himself stepping closer before he had even decided to move. The woman's gaze swept the crowd, searching for someone, though she seemed almost afraid of being seen. Her hair was wind-tossed and braided in a style he vaguely recognized from Apache camps on the far ridge, and her eyes held a depth that made Rowan's breath pause for reasons he could not yet name. She approached the town clerk with hesitant steps, her voice low as she announced her name, Nalin, age 28, and asked for the man she had been promised to. Whispering traveled swiftly through the onlookers, gathering like dust devils along the street. Rowan watched the clerk glance dismissively at her clothes, at her ancestry, at the fragile hope flickering in her eyes, and he felt something in his chest tighten in quiet anger. Nalin kept her head bowed, shoulders small, hands trembling against the blanket as if bracing for shame. The clerk's tone grew careless, almost belittling, as he listed off Rowan's name with surprised amusement, as though questioning how a rancher of Rowan Tate's standing would ever send for a bride like this. Rowan's jaw tightened, but he held his silence, studying instead the woman who did not flinch when others stared, though he could see the fear trying to steal the steadiness of her breath. Her courage fascinated him. Her loneliness mirrored something inside him. He wondered how long she had traveled, how many nights she had slept beside strangers, how many times she had been spoken to like something less than human, and why fate had placed her in front of him now. When she finally lifted her head, their eyes met. For a brief moment, just a breath, the world around them seemed to dim, the crowd's murmurs turning distant. Rowan stepped forward, hat in hand, voice low and warm as he introduced himself. Nalin blinked, startled, perhaps expecting disappointment or disgust, and she apologized immediately for her appearance, as though rehearsing an apology she had carried for miles. Rowan, taken aback by the fear in her tone, removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders without hesitation, the leather soft from years of wear. When her fingers brushed his as she held the coat closed, a small current of warmth slipped between them, subtle but impossible to ignore, and Rowan found himself wishing she would hold onto his touch a little longer. He asked softly if she was hungry, if she wished to walk with him to the place he had readied. Nalin nodded, though her voice remained uncertain, as if waiting for something to collapse beneath her feet. They walked side by side through the lively evening street, horses tied at posts, shop windows glowing, families sharing laughter on wooden porches. Yet somehow, in the middle of the noise and movement, the world around them slowed, as though granting them a private moment no one else could see. Rowan spoke lightly of the path home, of the horses he tended, of the extra room he had cleaned for her comfort. Nalin listened with a cautious hope of someone unused to kindness, each word uncovering a new curiosity inside her, as though she were trying to decide whether this man was truly gentle or merely courteous. Rowan walked slightly ahead when crowds thickened, creating a protective arc with his body, without making the gesture feel obvious. Nalin noticed, and something warm flickered inside her, an unfamiliar safety. She asked quietly if he was accustomed to walking these streets alone, surrounded by so many people. He hesitated before answering, surprised by how quickly she had seen what most missed. He told her that Copperbend was full of friends, but short on true company, full of voices, but light on warmth for a man who carried more silence than stories. Nalin glanced at him with a softness that felt like understanding, and he realized he had revealed more truth in one sentence than he normally shared in a month. When they reached his home, the lamps inside glowed softly against the warm, dry night. Houses stood not far apart, neighbors close enough to greet from porches. Yet Rowan's home felt set apart by an invisible distance only a lonely man would understand. As he opened the door for her, Nalin stepped inside with cautious steps. Her eyes immediately scanned the room, the simple wooden table, the tidy shelves, the hand-stitched quilt he had spent weeks choosing with care, unsure what colors she might prefer. She touched the edges of the quilt with gentle fingers, a surprisingly tender gesture that made Rowan's chest feel light. He found himself thinking absurd things, like how he wanted to know what she liked for breakfast, how she braided her hair, what she feared most, what she dreamed of. He wondered why these thoughts came so easily. He set water on the stove and prepared tea, noticing how her eyes followed his hands as if studying the shape of the life she had been brought into. When he handed her the cup, their fingers grazed again, another small spark, delicate yet undeniably real. They talked in quiet tones, her voice soft with exhaustion, his voice low with a gentleness he rarely showed. Nalin told him she could cook well, though she had never cooked in a stranger's home before. Rowan admitted he was a better rancher than a cook, and she smiled despite the weariness in her face, a smile so faint and shy it felt like a fragile gift he wanted to protect. As the night deepened, Rowan prepared the preacher's parlor lamp in his mind, though he said nothing yet. He sensed her nerves, so he spoke instead about little things, town habits, local dogs that wandered too far, children who chased tumbleweeds, letting her settle into the comfort of small stories. Nalin seemed grateful for this simple kindness, and Rowan watched her eyelids lower slightly, the fatigue finally catching her. He almost reached out to steady her, then stopped himself, unsure if she would welcome his hands just yet. The uncertainty stirred something in him, a longing he had no words for, and he wondered what she carried in her heart that made her both strong and trembling all at once. She asked suddenly why he had chosen her name from the list, and Rowan paused. He confessed quietly that her letter had felt honest in a way others hadn't. She had spoken not of beauty or promises, but of needing a home where she could work, contribute, breathe without fear. Her sincerity had reached him across miles, and though he had not said so aloud, the truth was he had been waiting, perhaps without realizing it, for someone whose strength echoed his own. Nalin lowered her gaze, touched by his words, and Rowan wondered how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her with simple respect. Later, when he guided her to rest in the small side room he had prepared, she hesitated in the doorway, looking back at him as though deciding whether she truly belonged here. Rowan told her that she was safe, that the house was hers as much as his, that she need not fear the whispers outside. She nodded slowly, voice trembling with relief or exhaustion. He could not tell which. Before she disappeared into the room, she whispered a soft thank you, and the words felt heavier and more intimate than he expected, stirring a warmth that followed him long after she closed the door. Rowan remained by the table long after the lamps dimmed, listening to the faint shifts in the quiet room where she had settled. He wondered what dreams she carried, what memories she fled, and what this new bond might become if handled with care. Outside, the town's last voices faded into the night, but inside, something tender had begun, a fragile beginning shaped by quiet courage and shared loneliness. Rowan could feel it, though he barely understood it, and he sensed that the arrival of this woman might change the shape of his days in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine. He extinguished the lanterns one by one, each flame bowing out like the closing of a chapter, until only the faint moonlight pressed against the windows. As he prepared to retire for the night, he felt the house breathe differently, as though warmed by her presence despite the silence. For the first time in years, Rowan realized he did not dread the morning. Instead, he felt a strange anticipation, gentle but persistent, curling through him like a rising breeze. He went to sleep wondering what tomorrow would bring, and why it suddenly mattered so much. Morning light spread over Copperbend with a soft amber glow, and Rowan Tate woke before the town stirred, listening to the quiet shift of footsteps from the room down the hall. Na Lin moved gently, as though still learning the shape of the space she now inhabited, and her presence made the house feel startlingly alive. Rowan stepped into the main room just as she emerged, wearing a simple dress she had mended the night before, the fabric no longer torn but still humble against her frame. She offered him a shy morning greeting, her voice softer than birdsong, and Rowan found himself studying the delicate determination in her eyes, wondering how someone could be both fragile and resilient in the same breath. She insisted on preparing breakfast, though her movements revealed nerves she tried to hide. Rowan noticed how her hands paused briefly above the stove, as if remembering she was no longer surviving among strangers, but living beside a man who saw her differently. He approached slowly, offering to help grind the cornmeal, and she smiled at the offer, her shoulders easing as though the simple act of sharing labor made her less afraid of missteps. Rowan was learning her silences, the way she spoke more through gestures and words, and he found unexpected comfort in the unspoken rhythm forming between them. As they sat to eat, the quiet warmth between them grew thicker, stirring a curiosity in Rowan he could not quite name, and he wondered how quickly such small rituals could start to feel like belonging. Throughout the following days, a gentle routine settled over the house. Rowan worked on the porch, tightening loose hinges and sanding the railing smooth, while Na Lin stitched fabric into new garments with remarkable precision. They exchanged glances that lingered too long, shared smiles that came too easily, and touched hands when passing tools or cups, each time a little less accidental than the last. There were moments Rowan found himself simply watching her from across the yard, how she lifted her face to the sunshine, how birds seemed to fly lower when she stepped outside, how her presence softened the sharpness his life once held. Na Lin caught him staring once, and instead of turning away, she stepped closer and offered him a timid hug, the kind that trembled slightly from inexperience. Rowan wrapped his arms around her gently, feeling her trust settle against his ribs like a warm secret he promised himself never to break. That evening, when the sun dipped low, she stood beside him on the porch, fingers resting lightly on the railing. The air carried the scent of warm clay and horse musk, a common perfume of the West, but Rowan suddenly felt the moment shift into something more tender. Na Lin spoke quietly about her past, about land she could not return to, about nights when hunger made sleep impossible, about the long, lonely miles she walked before ever stepping onto the stagecoach. Rowan listened without touching her, not wanting to break the thread of trust woven into every word she offered. When she finished, silence held them for a breath, and Rowan lifted her chin gently, letting their foreheads brush in the smallest, most reverent of gestures. Their first kiss was soft, nearly timid, but warm enough to make the lantern light behind them blur, and Rowan wondered how something so gentle could feel so momentous. But affection, once seen, did not stay unnoticed for long in Copperbend. Whispers surfaced quickly, soft at first, then louder, fueled by old prejudices and small-minded assumptions about what belonged and what didn't. Na Lin felt the shift immediately. The friendly nod she received on her first day became hesitant glances, and women on porches stopped conversations as she passed. Rowan tried to shield her from the change, but he could not stop the ripple of judgment that spread through the town like a slow-moving storm. Na Lin retreated into herself, shrinking her voice to a whisper, as if afraid her presence alone would become a burden. Rowan noticed, he always noticed, and the sight of her sorrow settled in him like a hidden wound that deepened with every passing day. The harm became unmistakable when a shopkeeper refused Na Lin's service. His face twisted with disdain as he claimed his goods were for proper Copperbend folk. Rowan had arrived only moments later, catching the tail end of the insult. He placed himself beside Na Lin with a steady calm that almost radiated heat, his voice low and firm as he asked the man to repeat what he had said. The shopkeeper faltered beneath Rowan's stare, unwilling to challenge a rancher with the respect of half the town. Yet he did not apologize either. Rowan guided Nalin out before the argument escalated, but she was trembling when they reached the edge of the street. That night, as he sat beside her in the dim kitchen, she confessed in a breaking whisper that she did not want to damage his standing in Copperbend. Rowan lifted her face gently, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, his voice tender as he told her she was not a burden and never would be. But judgment has a way of finding its loudest voice through those who resent change, and for Copperbend, that voice belonged to Caleb Maddox. Maddox had always carried a bitter edge, too many drinks, too few victories, and a jealousy that lingered like smoke around him. He confronted Rowan one afternoon outside the saloon, smirking as he made cruel remarks about Rowan's Indian bride, and the foolishness of choosing her over any townswoman. Rowan didn't rise to the taunts, not at first, because violence had never been his language. But Maddox saw restraint as weakness, and his voice grew uglier, his words crossing from insult into something darker. Rowan warned him quietly, his tone low enough that only Maddox could hear the steel beneath it. Yet Maddox left grinning, as though sensing the beginning of a fight he had long been eager to provoke. The tension thickened like dust before a windstorm. Nalin sensed it even before Rowan spoke a word, feeling the weight in his shoulders, the unspoken worry in his gaze. She tried to ease it by keeping to the house, by avoiding the main street, by brushing aside the shadows creeping into their days. But danger does not dissolve when you hide from it. It grows. And one evening, Rowan returned home to find the gate cracked open, swinging in the wind, and Nalin standing in the yard with wide, frightened eyes. Maddox had come by when Rowan was gone, taunting her, telling her she would never be truly welcome here. Rowan felt fury rise within him, not the hot, reckless kind, but a cold, steady anger carved from love and protectiveness. He walked to her slowly, speaking her name with a gentleness that steadied her trembling. She stepped into his arms without hesitation, burying her face against his chest, as though seeking the one place in the world where fear couldn't reach her. Rowan held her tightly, his hand moving up her back in a soothing rhythm, and it tore at him to feel how deeply she shook. When she whispered that she felt safe only when he held her, Rowan pressed a tender kiss to her hair, promising quietly that she would never face this alone. Yet even as he whispered those words, a part of him wondered when Maddox would strike next, and what line he would cross when he did. The answer came sooner than either of them expected. It was midday when Nalin walked toward the general store to fetch thread for sewing, the street warm beneath her feet, the air thick with murmurs from townsfolk who pretended not to stare. Maddox stepped forward from between two buildings, blocking her path with a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. He mocked her in a low voice, circling her with slow, deliberate steps, and Nalin tried to retreat, but he moved quicker than she anticipated. When he reached for her arm, she gasped, stumbling back, only for a shadow to fall sharply between them. Rowan arrived like a storm held barely in check, placing himself squarely in front of Nalin with a calm so intense it made Maddox falter. The street fell silent as Rowan spoke, voice low but resonant, warning Maddox to keep his distance from his wife. Maddox laughed, trying to provoke him, throwing insults meant to ignite violence. But Rowan didn't strike. He stood his ground, every muscle steady, his eyes dark with a warning no man with sense would ignore. Only when Maddox reached again toward Nalin did Rowan step forward, his tone dropping into something quiet and dangerous, promising consequences should Maddox ever touch her again. The confrontation drew the town's full attention. Eyes widened, whispers froze, and every onlooker suddenly seemed to understand that Rowan Tate was no longer the quiet rancher who kept himself. He was a man defending the woman who had become the center of his world. Maddox backed away under the force of Rowan's gaze, retreating not from fear or violence, but from the knowledge that he had lost whatever twisted dominance he imagined. And as he disappeared down the street, Nalin exhaled shakily, realizing Rowan had not only defended her, he had claimed her as someone worth standing for. Rowan didn't let her walk home alone. He lifted her onto his horse with a tenderness that made time slow, then mounted behind her, his arms strong and protective around her waist. She leaned against him as the wind brushed past, her breaths uneven but gradually settling into calm. When they reached the house, Rowan helped her down carefully, keeping her hand in his as though refusing to let the moment slip too quickly into memory. Inside the quiet shelter of their room, Nalin pressed her forehead to his chest, whispering that she belonged nowhere more than here, with him. Rowan kissed her softly, lingeringly, letting the truth of her words settle into the deepest corner of his heart. The night softened around them as they held each other, their breath mingling with the warmth of the lamps. Their bond deepened not by declarations, but by shared fear, shared courage, shared tenderness. Rowan touched her cheek gently, tracing the path of her earlier tears, and Nalin closed her eyes beneath his touch, the tremor in her breath fading into something steadier. And in that quiet, intimate moment, Rowan realized that love had already taken root, quietly, fiercely, and irrevocably. As the world outside dimmed into dusk, Rowan allowed himself to hope that their story, born of hardship and prejudice, might yet find a gentler road ahead, though a small voice inside warned that some storms only sleep before they rise again.